All right, everyone, welcome to lecture 2 for week 11. And in this mini lecture, we are going to move from talking about clients to talking about you all as the counselor. And I think that, I struggle with what to call this mini lecture because I could have just called it vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, but there are so many different aspects of the work that can impact us. And there's lots of language, different language around it too, which I'll talk about some. But I think just calling it the impact of working in trauma on counselors, it's kind of wordy, and maybe I'll reword it at some point, but that was kind of where I landed and wanting to talk to you all about how this work will impact you and how important it is that you stay, really reflective and monitoring yourself as you do trauma work. So how can your client's trauma affect you? The two things I want to focus on today are vicarious trauma and shared trauma. And I know that those were concepts that were discussed in a previous lecture and in a previous chapter that you read, but I feel like because it is the end of our term together, I want to kind of come back to these and talk a little bit more about them and leave you in a space where you're really thinking about this before you go into clinical work so that you can do things to prevent. So counselors are particularly at risk for vicarious trauma, but you might be wondering, what is vicarious trauma? Like, what does that actually mean? And so vicarious trauma is the emotional residue of listening to others' trauma stories and have those stories impact your thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors. So your worldview changes as a result of listening to trauma stories. And the larger your trauma caseload is, the more likely you are to be affected by vicarious trauma. And so for those of you who may go on to work in a trauma specialty, this will be something that you really have to pay attention to and work to prevent, because once it kind of has you in its grasp, much like burnout, which is different, but a related concept, it can pull you downhill really quickly and create an environment where it's not safe for you to see clients. Some of the symptoms of vicarious trauma are preoccupation when you're in session, so not being able to kind of focus in on your client, avoidance of either clients themselves or, kind of clients' triggers who you have now internalized as your own triggers. A hyperarousal, again, you're kind of taking on this symptom from your clients, a change in your worldview and your beliefs. So when you start thinking the world really is like a dangerous place and it's not safe to leave my house, if you see that your beliefs about people, about humanity, about the world are shifting, you're likely being affected by vicarious trauma. Of course, I say all that, and what I think immediately is, but you need to know yourself first, right? So you need to know what your worldviews are to know if they've shifted. And I know you do a lot of that work in your 520 class, which you had in the first term likely. But I think this is a good time to check in with yourself again about what you believe around people in general and humanity and the world itself, so that you can have a baseline for when you start seeing clients. But I think one of the most important things to point out about vicarious trauma is that you didn't experience a primary trauma, but you were showing symptoms of PTSD. And so you can pull up your DSM and look that up. And if you're meeting most of those criteria, but you didn't have a primary trauma event, then most likely you have vicarious trauma. I want to talk a little bit also about shared trauma. And again, I know we talked about this before, so this is just a review, but this occurs when counselors experience a community or regional trauma and are affected on multiple levels, such as primary, secondary, and vicarious trauma. And the reason that I wanted to highlight this again is I just think it's so common and we don't talk about it as much. There may be supervisors that may have never heard this term. I think that it's very tricky when, we get to the point that we are in full-time practice and something occurs in the community that you were also affected by. I think that's the time where you need to be very, very reflective and monitoring your own responses so that you don't potentially harm clients. And that doesn't mean that you can't see clients at all, but it means that you likely need to get your own counseling if you're not already in it. And you probably need to do some supervision, even if you're licensed. And you could do that through peer supervision groups, or contacting your licensure supervisor. Just because you're already licensed doesn't mean you can't go back to supervision if you feel like you need it. In some countries, like specifically in the UK, counselors have to stay in supervision their entire careers. And while that sounds like a lot, to go to supervision weekly or biweekly for your entire career, I can see a lot of benefits to that process and why they may have that role. So some implications of shared trauma are distancing from social interactions, disconnection during session. That probably sounds familiar to Vicarious trauma, devaluing your work, decreased empathy, and ethical obstacles such as blurred boundaries. And these could, of course, lead to potential harm to your client and to yourself. And I'm not just talking about suicidal ideation, but I mean harm in that you're not providing effective and ethical services because you aren't present during your sessions. So how do we prevent these things? We can't prevent the bad events from happening. Life happens and it's full of crappy stuff. But there are some things we can put in place to help prevent sort of that bleed over of the vicarious and shared trauma. So first of all, if you can, limit your trauma caseload. Now, this is obviously not always going to be the case, and you probably know clinicians who just do trauma work, and if they do that, I'm sure that they have lots of other things in place to help them cope with their caseload. And that includes things like dedication to self-care and boundaries. So, having a really good idea of what works for you, what helps you rejuvenate, what helps you stay present, what helps you be able to compartmentalize your work when you're at work and your home when you're at home, kind of really knowing yourself and also upholding the boundaries that help you do your work. So another thing you can do is limit clients affected by the same trauma, again, when it's possible. I did a lot of my clinical work at the Children's Advocacy Center, and so I saw, basically all trauma clients, and they were all affected by some sort of child abuse or neglect. And while the severity varied and the type of abuse varied, it was very heavy work, and most clinicians did not stay over about 3 years there. Now, I do still have one of my old supervisors that is still at the CAC that I worked for. She is in an administrative role. And I think one of the things she does with her self-care to really stay present is she sees some clients, she has her administrative role, and she does supervision. She may also be trained in forensic interviewing. So she does like 3 to 4 different roles so that she's not constantly being bombarded by other people's trauma, which I think if you do want to stay sort of long-term in a trauma role, having some variety to what you do could be really helpful. And then lastly, peer support and supervision. I think there are lots of great ways to seek out peer support. You all are in a cohort now. Many of you will be graduating at the same time. I would strongly suggest, like, when you find that you relate to somebody in the program, you continue that relationship after. That is built-in peer support. If you find though that doesn't work as well for you, maybe you're not in an area where other folks are, or even just like in a region, or you just find that you don't connect with anyone, that's okay too. There are lots of other ways to find peer support. And I would suggest things like joining your state association for networking events. You'll get emails and notifications for webinars and in-person seminars and workshops, CEU credits, networking events. Social media is really good for this too. Obviously, social media can be a double-edged sword, but around peer support, there are several like mental health groups that I am in for practitioners that really serve as a way to have a touch point. And some people will occasionally try to get staff cases very minimally in those private groups. But what I see come out of them that I think is even more helpful is like local meetups for professionals where they can spend maybe an hour to an hour and a half of peer supervision in a physical location that's secure and confidential. And so if you can't find something like that, maybe it's a good idea to start something like that. And then of course the supervision you'll get at your sites. You will also have a university instructor for supervision, and once you graduate, you'll have your licensure supervisor. And those should always be your first point of contact for almost anything, any kind of, concern you have related to clients or yourself and your ability to be present in the session with your clients and be ethical and be efficacious. So supervision can be about your clients, but it should also be about your ability to serve your clients. Just not counseling, but you can talk about personal stuff in there if it's affecting how you are able to be with your clients. And then let's say you did all that, you tried to prevent it, but you are still struggling, which happens to the best of us. Here are some ideas for different ways you can seek to treat it. Personal counseling, obviously. Increased supervision. Most states have a minimum supervision time for licensure. That doesn't mean that you can't do more or come back to supervision if you find you need it after licensure. In some instances, you will need to take time off, and you could also use that as a preventative measure. I think that's a really good idea. To schedule time off, a couple of times a year if you can't afford to do that, which we can't all do. But try to take time off so that when if you find yourself needing treatment for vicarious trauma, your clients are kind of used to having some breaks in their treatment. You can definitely reestablish your wellness practices. The wellness plan that you came up with at the beginning of this program will likely not be the one that works for you forever, right? Because we grow and change, and our priorities change, and how we view wellness and rejuvenation will change. And so I really encourage you to always be asking yourself, like, is my wellness working? Is my self-care routine helping me, or is it just something I'm going through the motions? And you'll have a couple of opportunities to rewrite that while you're in the program so that you're used to that. And when you get out, you can come back to it and say, okay, I know that like every 6 months I should check in with myself on my self-care routine and see if it's working. And that will help you, of course, implement lasting strategies. So what does work for you on a continual basis? Another thing that you could do within the scope of counseling, or even in your own self-reflection, because now you know about post-traumatic growth and you know what factors help aid in post-traumatic growth. And so you could work towards post-traumatic growth for yourself. All right, and this is a chart on shared trauma, protective factors, early warning signs, and self-care. And again, it's just strategies or ideas. And so I'm just going to kind of read through these. You can read them for yourself as well, of course. But so we'll start with protective factors and move to warning signs and self-care. The protective factor would be strong emotional boundaries, social support, ability to reframe, resiliency, establishing a professional network, meaning making, and practicing mind, body, and spiritual wellness. Early warning signs that something may be going on with you could be things like distancing from social situations, so isolation. We know that's a common trauma response. Becoming avoidant of your client's trauma material. So instead of kind of going where they need to go, you are redirecting them to avoid trauma material. Not being present during counseling, so you're dissociating. Devaluing your work. Emotional or physical exhaustion, decreased empathy. Ooh, that's a big one. It's hard to be a competent counselor if you can't feel empathy. And anger towards clients. So what are some self-care strategies that could help you? Always having positive self-care in all of the different realms of self-care that we talk about. So if you go back and look at the Wellness Well or other models of wellness, where are you? Check in, and what do you need to get where you want to be? And that doesn't mean that everything has to be equal, because some realms are going to be more important to you than others. And that's a very individualized process. Self-awareness and treatment of any primary trauma that you have. I know that we talk all the time about the benefits of counselors being in counseling, but especially related to trauma, if you have unresolved primary trauma, it will come up. It will. And it will probably come up early. In my experience, I've seen for myself and students that I have supervised that one issue that they have not done work on is like the third client to walk through their door. So it's a really important act of, radical self-care to seek treatment for yourself. Be mindful of countertransference. We certainly don't want to put things on our clients that aren't there because of our unprocessed stuff. Seek out client resilience, because just like there is vicarious trauma, there is also vicarious resilience. And I don't think I have an article on that in the module right now, but I'll try to find one for you all so that you have it. Outside supervision, of course, is always helpful. Being creative, what helps you feel good, what helps you feel alive, and creativity, creating something from nothing or changing something from what it was to something new can feel very invigorating. And of course, working towards post-traumatic growth. So the bottom line is you want to prevent that transfer of trauma from your clients to yourself as much as you can. But if it does, be ready to address it, because in the long term, you cannot continue to see clients competently and ethically if you are not addressing your own stuff. And that's where I want to end this. So thank you so much for your time this term. You all have done a great job with your assignments, and I feel really good about all of you moving forward into this next chapter. But also please know that this is not the end, and my door is always open for you, my figurative door since we're online. If you're in practicum and I'm not your professor, that doesn't mean you can't reach out to me. I'm always happy to staff cases, or if you know that I have clinical expertise in certain things that you are dealing with, all you have to do is email me and set up a Zoom. All right, thanks so much and have a great day.